Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Sports on the Positive Tip podcast. This is the podcast where we have conversations at the intersection of sports and faith, and a lot of faith today, but we're going to talk about an interesting sports story as well. I'll be joined by my partner, Kenny Squared, in just a bit, and today we had the honor of having storyteller, author, and pastor Donny Abbott on the call today. And Donny got into so many great things. Donny is the author of the book called Christ in the Storm, as well as the children's book, Stanley the Claustrophobic Miner. And we talked a lot about what happens if you think you disappointed God, what happens if you always have constant fear, and a bunch of other things from his book. And the interesting sports story we're going to have. How many of you know the story of Ray Chapman? A tragic story for sure. We're going to get into that and so much more. You don't want to miss a second of this. Let's get to it. Hey there, everybody. This is Kenny, and I'm joined by my partner, Kenny Squared. Welcome back to the Sports on the Positive Tip podcast. And this is where we have conversations at the intersection of sports and faith. But we are going to talk a lot of faith today. And we have got a very special guest that we are going to jump right in and get to, because there's so much I want to get from him. Storyteller, author, and pastor Donny Abbott has joined us today. He's in the house. Donny, thank you so much. How you doing there, sir?
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me on. To both of you guys, it's a pleasure.
Oh, it is our pleasure. So I'm going to hold it up here because Donny has authored two just phenomenal books. I got a chance to read this over the weekend: Christ in the Storm, Keeping Faith in the Face of the Unknown, and a children's book, which I'm going to ask him about the differences there. I know Kenny will. Stanley the Claustrophobic Miner. And both just awesome books. I can't wait to put this in the hands of my grandson. Kenny's a little boy there. He ain't little anymore, even though he's only 3, but so we can't wait to really dive into some great stuff with you this morning. So with that, I'm going to first turn it over to Kenny, and he's got a couple questions for you.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm just going to start out with, can you tell us a little bit about your story? Like your journey of how you got to where you are?
Yeah. So I am from Anaheim, California. Lived there with my mom, my dad, and my brother, who's just over a year younger than I am. And had a pretty good childhood growing up. Although my dad was an atheist, he was pretty passionate, pretty passionately against the church. He believed all the old cliches that church is a crutch, pastors just want your money, and can't you think for yourself? And then my mom she was a believer, but she was a pretty passive believer. My dad was a more powerful personality. And what that made for was my mom, my brother, and I would attend church maybe 3 or 4 times a year, and that's Christmas, Easter, and maybe 2 or 3 other times. But somehow during those few church visits in my childhood, by the time I was 14, I was alone in my bedroom one night, and I came to the realization that I'm a sinner desperately in need of a savior. And I asked Jesus to come in my life and forgive me of my sins. And at that moment, my life did not change because I was 14. I had no church influence. I had no Christian influence. I was a freshman in high school. I played a lot of baseball and football all through high school. And then after high school, I went into the Army. Again, no Christian influences there. And it wasn't until I was discharged from the Army that I moved back to California. I moved out to the desert, Palm Desert, California, and I met up with a guy named Dan Kenley. And Dan and his brother, Jim, they operated the largest pool service in the whole Coachella Valley, from Palm Springs out to Coachella. And I went to work for Dan, just learning the ins and outs of the pool business. And little did I know, but Dan was also an elder at Southwest Community Church, which at the time was the largest church there in the Coachella Valley. Dan would invite me to come to church, and And one day I accepted his invitation, and that is what changed my life. Soon after that, I was baptized and got involved in children's ministry, youth ministry, parking cars. I mean, I was doing it all at this church, and that kind of set me on the path for my career. I ended up going into part-time work there at Southwest, and that went into full-time. And then I attended Biola University, which is where I got my undergrad, and then went to Multnomah University in Portland, Oregon for my seminary. And I've been on staff at 5 different churches in California, up in Bellevue, Washington, Sugar Land, Texas, Portland, Oregon, and here in Fort Collins, Colorado. So that's kind of my journey in short.
Wow.
Wow. So it sounds like you've been a lot of different places.
Yeah.
So, and also I think that's interesting too, because like, I mean, both of us, we've only been pastors of one place. Like, I moved to Cleveland now almost 7 years ago, but like before that, like moving around isn't really much of a thing that we like. Our family, that's not really in our grid system.
Yeah.
So more specifically, obviously you've written a couple books here. What really got you into writing?
Well, I've always enjoyed writing, even going back to when I was a kid. I enjoyed creative writing. So it's always kind of been an outlet for me, something that I've really enjoyed over the years. And I like storytelling. I've also written a baseball screenplay, interestingly, Kenny, about a Cleveland Indian shortstop, Ray Chapman, who was the only baseball player to ever die from an on-field injury, and that happened in 1920. So I wrote a screenplay about that. I've written several songs. So I just like the creative outlet of writing.
Awesome.
Wow. We'll talk maybe a little bit of sports later, because I want to hear more about that. If I recall, I don't recall, I wasn't around 1920, but I think Ray Chapman was hit by a pitch, right, in the temple.
He was.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Wow. I wanna jump in and ask you about Visio Divina, and that seems to be a big part of what you do and inspires you a lot. And if my understanding is right on that, if I remember, I'm sure Kenny knows what this is. It's really the ability to kind of enter into a sacred image and to really immerse yourself to see what God is saying, through some of these images. If I have that right, but I know
Yes,
you're going to explain a little.
absolutely. Yep, that's correct.
Oh,
It's
okay. All right. Awesome. So how has that now influenced your writing? And then I want to really ask you about the art aspect and faith, because I find this extremely interesting how you put this together.
Well, I mean, just looking at the picture of the bison behind me, you could practice Visio Divina looking at that picture, just contemplating the power and brute strength of that bison, and how it's got characteristics of God. We believe, or I believe, that in our created world, there's elements of God in everything that God has created. So, but I also believe that when it comes to the creative work of men, anytime you can look at a picture or a work of art, particularly a religious work of art, I always try to put myself into that piece and see how would I feel in it. What is God doing in that particular work of art? What is he trying to convey? What was the artist trying to convey? Many of these, I like old works of art, particularly going back to the Renaissance time period. But, that was the medium that people communicated. I mean, there was the written form, but there wasn't TV and radio back then. So people had to articulate or convey things through art. And I think there's a lot to be learned there. So what I do with works of art is I just simply sit there and stare at them and see what is God saying to me through that painting.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that. Kenny, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the art thing, I'm very interested, like, because I feel like the two books that we just saw, they're very different. Do you have like a different process in how you how you built both of those books, or is it kind of like this is like it was the same thing but two different things came out? Like, what was that process like?
Yeah, they're completely different. With the Stanley book, Stanley was actually a character in a vacation Bible school that I wrote 25 years ago, back at my first church in Palm Desert. And so he was just a character. It was the vacation Bible school theme was a gold mining Western theme. And Stanley was simply a character of a cast of about 10 different characters. But he was such a lovable character. The kids really took to him, and he had a catchy song. And so anyway, I thought this could be a really good, cute children's picture book. So I wrote the text to that in picture book form, and that has its own kind of craft to it. You know, picture books are 30, usually industry average, or 32 pages in length, and they're usually about 500 to 800 words. So, you know, there's not a lot of text, but hence that's why they're picture books. So I created the text for that, and then pretty much put it on the shelf for about 20 years. And it wasn't until maybe 6 or 7 years ago that I sent the text off to an editor here in Fort Collins. She edited it, and then I thought, you know, I want to finish this book. So I went through a life plan with a life plan facilitator, and I had these 3 different writing projects that were in different phases of completion: Stanley, Christ in the Storm, and this baseball screenplay. And this life plan facilitator, he's like, Donnie, this is low-hanging fruit, man. You got to knock this out. So that was kind of the kick in the pants that I needed to finish these writing projects. So with Stanley, children's picture books are really expensive to produce because of the color pictures. You know, you got to hire a graphic artist, and that costs a lot of money. And then you got to print these things, and that costs a lot of money. So, you know, I would do funerals and weddings, and I even was mucking horse stalls for a year just to save money to pay for a page of Stanley. So that took about 18 months to do that. But all in all, you know, Stanley was a 25-year journey, but I'm pretty proud of that book. And then you move over to Christ in the Storm. That was actually a short devotional that I gave to my staff at the church I work at back in 2017. Every Wednesday, we gathered together as a church staff for an hour of inspiration. And so I shared Christ in the Storm, you know, just in brief with them. And they were so captivated by it that they were encouraged. Yeah, but all of Christ in the Storm started with Lectio Divina.
Wow. That's so cool.
Yeah. Man, oh man. I don't, it's almost like splitting yourself in two a little bit, which is amazing. Amazing that you did that. Kenny, I want to get into the book if that's okay.
Yeah.
And because, well, the Christ in the Storm one, and what was the inspiration to use the Jesus in the Sea of Galilee story kind of weave throughout the book, Donnie?
Yeah, well, that's such a great story. It's found in Matthew 8 and Luke 8, and it's such a classic story because of all of the upheaval that's happening. But it didn't start out that way. You know, there was a time when the boat was on the shore, And Jesus is like, all right, fellas, let's hop in. We're going to go for a ride. And I'm guessing these 12 disciples thought they were going for a leisurely, twilight cruise. But Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in spite of all of that, I mean, they are heading into this storm, and these guys, many of whom had lived their lives out on the lake as fishermen, they were well aware of the weather patterns and the currents of the Sea of Galilee and how dangerous the situation was. And what was Jesus doing? He's snoring. He's sleeping.
Taking a snooze, yeah.
And I just think that so resonates with me and so many other people, because we often think that when we go through trials and struggles in our lives, it can feel like God is sleeping. And but what we learn is that Jesus displays his power oftentimes in the backdrop of the trials of our lives. And that's what happened out on the boat on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus proved to them that he was and he is God. So he wakes up, stands up, turns to the storm and says, "Peace, be still." And then he turns to the fellas and he's like, "Hey boys, where is your faith? I mean, here I am, the creator of the universe. Do you think I'm going to let this boat sink?" And, I think up to that point, Jesus had healed demoniacs, he had healed lepers, but that was a pivotal moment in their lives and in their belief in him when they saw that he had control over creation. That's a whole different level. So I think I applied that to my own life. Last year, my family went through heck. My wife and I, we've been married for 25 years, but we had a tough go at the early part of the year last year. We had to work through some things, and then we have 3 boys. Our oldest is out of the house, but we have 2 teenagers in the house, and separately, they both had really significant issues that we had to put our heads together. And quite honestly, I was just questioning, God, where are you? Where are you? Are you sleeping? So my wife was actually quoting my book back to me. And I'm sitting there like, wow, that's really good. Where did you get that? And she said, "You wrote it, dummy."
I love that. It is such a the way you just put that. I hadn't thought about that before. How we sometimes think that Jesus is asleep, right? Like he actually was then. And thank God you're through. It sounds like you're through the storm. I want to ask real quick about 2 chapters, because I don't want to give away the book. I want people to pick it up. And I was telling you this before we came on air, is one that I get asked a lot, and that is, do I disappoint God? And what if you could sum that question up a little bit, because I struggle sometimes with answering that question. If you could sum that up a little bit, and in the chapter, talk to us a little bit about that chapter about, do I disappoint God?
Yeah, that's a hard one, man. I wrote that chapter because that's something that I have always struggled with, and quite frankly, I still struggle with it, because I feel like I feel like I should be in a better place spiritually than where I am physically, just everything. I constantly struggle with feelings of being inadequate. And, I mentioned in that, I think it's in that chapter, remember Dos Equis had that great commercial, the most interesting man in the world. This was a guy whose blood smelled like cologne. And when he went swimming in the ocean, dolphins appeared, and he could speak Russian and French and all those kind of things. This guy didn't suffer from feeling inadequate, right? He always had hot chicks around him, but that's not the case with most guys. Most of
Right.
us struggle with
Yeah.
feeling inadequate, like we're not good enough husbands, we're not good enough fathers, we're just not good enough. And that leads us to believe that we disappoint God. And I just want to share that with everybody, that God isn't disappointed with us. I think He is
Yes.
at times with our actions, but God sees the long game, man. He sees the goal line, and God. There's that fancy church word, sanctification. Where we're all becoming more and more like Jesus, and hopefully that's the case with all of us until our last dying breath. But God's not disappointed in us. God is our biggest cheerleader. He's not this cosmic ogre sitting up in heaven with his arms crossed and shaking his finger at us. No. We read in His Word that God is our great lover. He is the pursuer of our hearts, right? We see that from the first book of Scripture all the way to the end, that God is the pursuer of man. Well, you don't pursue something if you're disappointed in them. You pursue them because you love them. So God's not disappointed in you.
Oh man, you saw me
good.
cheering over there, probably because the way you built that up, and it's so brilliantly written, man. You are such a brilliant writer. I just was visualizing so much as I was reading that, but to hear you talk about it is just as good, man. But oh my gosh, Kenny, I promise one more question for me, and then I'm going to turn the rest over to you, because I do want to. You have a chapter on fear, and that just seems to be all over the place. I mean, we had the bank collapse this past weekend, and
Yeah.
we've got wars going on. There's just so much stuff that even believers I'm finding, and I'm actually a little bit surprised at times that we've got believers that are, I'll even use another word, terrified of things, these days. But yet the way you bring it together and talk about fear, I thought was just, it really spoke to me. So tell us a little bit about the chapter on fear.
Yeah, that was another tough chapter because we all experience varying levels of fear. And I share in that chapter about my fear of the girl from the movie The Exorcist. And I don't recommend anybody watch that movie because it's truly a horrifying movie. But I'm telling you, I watched it when I was 12 years old, and that movie truly scarred me. To the point that when I got out of the army, like I said, I moved out to the desert and was living alone. Man, fear was my friend. I mean, my constant companion during that time. And particularly, I was fearful of that girl. I was fearful of the demonic realm. And it got so bad, here I am, a 24, 25-year-old man. I'm taking showers. I'm outside of the shower. And you're like, well, how do you take a shower outside of the shower? Well, I'd put my head in the shower and, wash my hair. I put my arm, different body parts in, but I wasn't going to get fully in the shower and close the curtain because I just knew that girl was going to pop over the top of the shower curtain. So that's how crazy my fears were. But and then I was also a paratrooper in the Army. So I was airborne, jumped out of airplanes, and there's a fair amount of fear anytime you jump out of a perfectly good airplane, right? So yeah, but fear and faith are close cousins with one another. It's almost like you can't have one without the other. When I was in that aircraft and I'm standing in the door, there's fear there for sure because you're fearful of the unknown. You really don't know what's going to happen once you jump out of that aircraft. What you hope for and what you place your faith in that moment is that your parachute's going to open. And I just think it's the same way with us in our daily lives. How do how do we manage our fears? And as I've gotten older, I've come to fear God more than I fear Satan and his minions. And I think that's a rightly placed fear, to have a righteous fear of God. So anyway, yeah, I think it's constant struggle for me, and I'm sure it is for a lot of people, about how to manage your fears.
Yeah, no doubt. No, thank you so much for that, and it's so inspiring. And I'm right along with you. I saw The Exorcist at about the same age. I might have been 11, and I shouldn't have saw it at 11. And that is the one movie, and Kenny knows this, that I'll never watch again. If it comes on TV, I turn real fast.
Yeah.
And I've seen the horror movies. That's the one that just I couldn't sleep that night, I remember, and I
Yeah.
had a lot of the same fears. But thank you so much, for that. And people will be blessed reading that chapter as well. So, Kenny, I'll leave it to you for one or two more questions, and you can close us out.
Yeah, so I do want to ask one more question on the book, kind of a bigger general question. So let's say someone is going through a storm, whether that's like a big family crisis, financial, whatever. What would be like your one piece of advice for them to kind of get through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been reading in First Corinthians lately, and in chapter 2, Paul is talking about how he's not eloquent in his speaking, and he's imploring everyone to focus on the wisdom of God. But in verse 4, he says, "My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with the demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power." And I just love that, because, man, whatever we're facing, if it's divorce, grief, financial instability, job insecurity, all of those things are things of this world. And are we putting our faith and trust in things of this world, or on human wisdom, or are we putting our faith and trust on God's power? And that goes back to, the Christ in the Storm book. And what Jesus, again, what he illustrated is that he has command over the winds and the waves. He has command over financial institutions, he has the ability to heal bodies. We see that time and time again in Scripture, right? He has the ability to be our great provider, and he is our great provider. So I would say to anyone who is currently going through a struggle to keep the faith. Don't focus on the storm, but focus on Jesus.
Oh, that's awesome.
Amen.
And I have another question. Part of me is like, but that's also a great way to end it too. Well, you know what? We'll end it there. I think that's a good way to end it.
I'm stunned you're not going to ask about Ray Chapman. So now this is a screenplay?
That's where I was thinking about.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We got to find out just a few seconds of that. Yeah. Yeah. Is that, you said, a screenplay that you wrote? Is that something that's coming out, or
no, it's a long story. It would really take a
what's an interesting factor to that we should know about Ray Chapman? Because I don't think any of us know much about him, right? Except that he's the only player that unfortunately died, from getting hit by a pitch.
Yeah, it's a great story, an unbelievable story. Happened in 1920, August of 1920. The Yankees and the Indians, they're engaged in the pennant race. Baseball is just coming out of the 1919 Black Sox scandal that plagued baseball. And so they were looking for a real sense of hope for the 1920 season, and they found it in the Cleveland Indians. And their shortstop was Ray Chapman. And Ray Chapman was a really lovable guy. Everybody loved Chapman. And they were facing the Yankees. It was August 15th, I believe it was, 1920. They're playing in New York, and it's a cloudy, misty kind of day. And Chapman comes up to bat, and he's facing Carl Mays, who is the pitcher for the Yankees. And Mays was a real surly kind of guy. Nobody liked Mays. In fact, his reputation was even worse than Ty Cobb's at the time. His own teammates couldn't stand him. So you've got this conflict that is happening with the super nice guy and the really bad villain. You know, they're coming to a head, I think, in the third or fourth inning of that game. And Mays throws the ball. He was also a sidearm pitcher, so he had the sidearm delivery. He was known spitballer as well, and a known headhunter. So you've got all those things.
Wow.
And playing in his favor, really intimidated batters. So Chapman comes up to bat, and Mays throws the pitch, and it hits Chapman right behind his left ear. Chapman was a right-handed batter, hit him right behind his left ear. And they said that a skull just eggshelled. It just cracked on that side of his head. He fell down. There was almost a brawl that happened. They brought the ambulance out to short center field, just past second base. Chapman started to walk, and then he collapsed, and they loaded him in the ambulance, took him to the hospital, and he died at 4:00 the next morning. And to this day, in Major League Baseball, he's still the only on-field fatality. So just a great story. It's a tragic story. There's a love story in there between Chapman and his wife. She came from a really wealthy family there in Cleveland. Her dad was in the natural gas and oil industry. So it's an amazing story. Unfortunately, my script will never get made because the rights to the book was purchased by a screenwriter friend of mine. And she wrote a screenplay and turned it into a documentary that was just released last fall called War on the Diamond. Oh. So I hope that your listeners check that out. It's kind of like a 30 for 30 ESPN kind of deal. Mm-hmm. So check that out. But it's a great story.
Wow. You had me on that. Wow. What a story. And what a tragic story. They didn't have helmets yet, right?
No, not then. But wow. that was a leading factor in pushing baseball to wearing helmets. And also at that time, they didn't change out baseballs. When there was a foul ball hit into the stands, the fans would just throw the ball back because owners didn't want to spend money on baseballs. Yeah. So they would use the same baseball time and time again. And these things are just getting all beat to heck. These guys would spit their tobacco juice on it. Just everything, just nasty. So even the balls were darker in color and hard to pick up on a drizzly day, you know. So yeah.
Wow. Hey, so last quick thing I'll say, and Kenny, you can take us home. That's a fascinating story. Now we've got to watch that documentary. But you're looking at the big Yankee fan, not me, but him, Kenny, biggest Yankee fan there is. And now he lives there in Cleveland. So yeah. So irony there to the story. Oh man, Donny, thank you so much. This has been amazing, and we really hope to connect with you again. This has just been absolutely amazing. God bless your journey. Folks, the book is Christ in the Storm. The other book is Stanley the Claustrophobic Miner. I'll hold that up. Christ in the Storm. It was an easy read. It didn't take me long to read it, but boy, oh boy, you will be engrossed. And we'll take pictures of little Isaac there when he starts to peruse through Stanley the Claustrophobic Miner, because I love to read books now, which is great. So thank you again, Donny. This has been amazing.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Kenny, take us home.
All right. This is Kenny Squared N.
And Kenny and Donny
with Sports on the Positive Tip. Yeah, get those books. I'm excited for Isaac to read them too. It's going to be fun.
Yeah.
We'll see you guys next time.
All right. See you, fellas.